No one noticed the man standing at the back of the church, watching his own funeral. The black umbrellas outside trembled under the cold morning rain. And inside the small-town church, every seat was filled. People whispered quietly, their voices low and heavy with fake sympathy. At the front of the room sat a polished wooden casket, surrounded by white lilies and roses that carried the scent of forced grief. Robert Hayes stood near the entrance, hidden behind a tall marble pillar, his coat pulled tightly around him. His gray beard was trimmed shorter than usual, and a dark cap covered most of his face. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another stranger paying respects. But this was not just another funeral. This was his funeral. 3 weeks earlier, Robert Hayes had been declared dead. At least, that's what his family wanted the world to believe. From his position near the back, Robert's eyes scanned the room slowly, carefully. He spotted his daughter Emily sitting in the front row, dressed in black, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. Her husband, Mark, sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, pretending to comfort her. Robert felt his chest tighten, not with sadness, but with something colder, betrayal. Emily hadn't cried once when the doctors told her he was gone. He remembered that moment clearly. The hospital room had been silent except for the steady beep of machines and the low murmur of doctors speaking in hushed voices. That day was supposed to be the end of his life. Instead, it became the beginning of his revenge. 3 weeks earlier, Robert had collapsed in his living room after feeling a sharp pain across his chest. The pain had been sudden and brutal, forcing him to his knees. He had reached for his phone, barely able to breathe, and called Emily. She arrived quickly, faster than he expected. Too quickly. "Dad, don't worry," she had said, her voice calm, almost too calm. "I'm calling an ambulance." Robert remembered how she stood near the doorway, speaking softly into her phone, her back turned to him. He had assumed she was talking to emergency services. But later, he realized she wasn't. At the hospital, everything moved fast. Doctors rushed him into a room. Machines were attached to his chest, and nurses whispered medical terms he barely understood. His vision blurred, and his hearing faded into distant echoes. Somewhere in the room, he heard Emily and Mark talking quietly. He hadn't meant to listen, but when a man thinks he might be dying, every sound becomes sharper. "I told you this would happen sooner or later," Mark whispered. Emily replied, her voice low but steady. "Just make sure everything is ready. Once he's gone, the house will be ours. The insurance too." Robert's heart didn't stop that day, but something inside him did. Trust. Hours later, doctors told Emily that Robert had gone into cardiac arrest. His body lay motionless, machines surrounding him, and the medical team worked desperately to stabilize him. What no one outside that room knew was that Robert's heart started beating again. Weak, but alive. A young nurse named Daniel had been the first to notice. "Doctor, he's got a pulse," Daniel said, his voice urgent but controlled. But the doctor on duty hesitated. Robert remembered the strange silence that followed. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His body felt trapped, heavy, like he was buried under layers of stone. Yet he could hear everything. "Family already signed the DNR papers," the doctor muttered. "Time of death has been recorded." Daniel sounded confused. "But he's alive." "Leave it," the doctor snapped. "We're done here." That moment changed everything. Robert lay there, unable to move, fully aware that he was being abandoned, declared dead while still alive. Later that night, when the hospital lights dimmed and the hallway quieted, Daniel returned alone. Robert remembered the sound of hurried footsteps and the soft rustle of gloves being pulled on. "You're still here," Daniel whispered, his voice shaking slightly. Moments later, Robert felt hands checking his pulse again. Alive. Barely, but alive. Daniel didn't call anyone else. Instead, he made a choice that would change Robert's fate forever. For the next several days, Robert was hidden in a small private care room at the back of the hospital. Off the records, off the system. Daniel secretly treated him, bringing medication, checking his vitals, and slowly helping him recover. At first, Robert didn't understand why the nurse was risking his career. Until one night, Daniel sat beside his bed and spoke quietly. "My father died in this hospital 5 years ago," he said. "Declared dead too early. Nobody listened when I said something was wrong. Robert listened silently, his strength still too weak to respond. I'm not letting that happen again, Daniel added. That was the moment Robert realized he had been given a second life, and he would use it carefully. During his recovery, Daniel handed him a small tablet one evening. You should see this, he said. Robert watched the screen with trembling hands. It showed security footage from the hospital hallway, footage Daniel had secretly copied. Emily and Mark stood near the nurse's station, whispering urgently. Emily's voice, though low, was clear enough. Once he's officially declared dead, we can file the insurance claim immediately, she said. Mark nodded. And the house? The lawyer already checked. It transfers to you automatically. Robert stared at the screen, his fingers tightening around the edges of the tablet. In that moment, grief turned into something sharper, something colder, something dangerous. Revenge. Days turned into weeks as Robert slowly regained strength. Daniel helped him walk again, step by careful step. The old man who once struggled to stand eventually found himself strong enough to move on his own. But he didn't return home. Not yet. Instead he waited, watched, planned. Through public records and on-line notices, Robert discovered something that made his blood run cold. His funeral had been scheduled. Not delayed. Not reconsidered. Scheduled quickly, as if someone was in a hurry to bury him. Standing now at the back of the church, watching his daughter pretend to mourn, Robert felt his jaw tighten. He watched as Mark leaned toward Emily and whispered something into her ear. She nodded slightly. And then he saw it. A faint smile. Not grief. Not sadness. Relief. Robert slowly reached into his coat pocket and felt the small envelope hidden inside. Inside that envelope were copies of the evidence he had gathered, recordings, documents, and signatures that would destroy the lies built around his death. But he wasn't ready to reveal himself yet. Not until the perfect moment. At the front of the church, the pastor stepped forward and cleared his throat. We gather here today to honor the life of Robert Hayes, he began solemnly. Robert took a slow breath. This was it. The moment he had waited for. The moment that would shatter everything his family believed was secure. And as the pastor continued speaking, Robert stepped slightly forward, moving out from behind the pillar, his shadow stretching across the church floor. Someone near the back noticed him first. A woman turned her head, her eyes widening in confusion, because the man standing there looked exactly like the one lying inside the coffin. And in that single moment, the quiet church began to fill with whispers. The kind of whispers that come just before the truth explodes. The whispers started quietly at first, like a ripple moving across still water, but within seconds they grew louder, sharper, filled with confusion and disbelief. A woman near the back clutched her purse tightly and leaned toward the man sitting beside her. That man, she whispered nervously. Doesn't he look like? Her words stopped as Robert took another slow step forward into the open light. The pastor paused mid-sentence, his voice fading as his eyes lifted from the paper in his hands. For a long second, he simply stared, his face losing color as if he had just seen a ghost step out of a nightmare. At the front row, Emily shifted slightly in her seat, unaware of what was happening behind her. Mark noticed the movement in the crowd first. He turned his head casually at first, irritated by the sudden noise. Then his face froze. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Robert could see it clearly. The moment recognition hit him like a hammer. Mark's hand tightened around Emily's shoulder, his grip suddenly painful. Emily, he whispered, his voice dry and cracking. Don't turn around. But she did. Slowly. Carefully. And the moment her eyes landed on Robert, the color drained from her face so fast it looked unnatural. Her hand dropped the tissue she had been holding, and it fluttered to the floor like a dead leaf. For a few seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. Robert kept walking forward, each step measured, calm, deliberate. The sound of his shoes against the wooden floor echoed loudly through the stunned silence. The closed casket stood only a few feet away from him now. His name engraved in gold on a small metal plate. Robert Hayes. Beloved father. 1948 to 2026. He stared at the date for a moment, then lifted his eyes slowly toward Emily. Funny thing about death, Robert said quietly, his voice steady but cold. Sometimes it doesn't stick. Gasps filled the room instantly. Someone screamed softly. A chair scraped loudly against the floor as a man stood up in shock. Emily shook her head slowly, her lips trembling. "No," she whispered. "No, this isn't possible." But Robert didn't stop walking. He stepped past the casket, past the flowers, until he stood directly in front of her. Close enough to see the panic flooding her eyes. Close enough to see the guilt she was trying desperately to hide. "You look surprised," Robert said calmly. Mark suddenly stood up from his seat, his chair crashing backward against the floor. You were declared dead." Mark stammered loudly. This is some kind of mistake." Robert turned his gaze toward him slowly, his expression unreadable. "Oh, it was a mistake," he said. "Just not the kind you think." The crowd had fully erupted into whispers now. Phones were being pulled out. Some people stared wide-eyed, others leaned forward as if watching a scene from a movie. Emily struggled to stand, her knees visibly shaking. How are you here?" she asked weakly. Robert reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small envelope he had carried with him. The same envelope he had protected like a weapon. "That," he said quietly, holding it up between his fingers, "is a very long story." The pastor stepped back, speechless, unsure whether to intervene or run. Robert glanced around the room slowly, taking in every shocked face, every whisper, every trembling hand. This was exactly the moment he had imagined during the long nights in that hidden hospital room. The moment when truth would crack open the lies. "I didn't come here to ruin a funeral," Robert continued calmly. "I came here to finish something that should have never started." Mark stepped forward aggressively, trying to regain control of the situation. "You shouldn't be here," he snapped. "You're causing a scene." Robert tilted his head slightly. "A scene," he repeated. "You planned my death, signed papers, arranged my funeral. And I'm the one causing a scene?" Mark opened his mouth but couldn't find words fast enough. Emily reached for his arm, her fingers trembling violently. "Mark," she whispered urgently. "Say something." But Mark stayed silent. Because deep down he knew. The game was collapsing. Robert turned his attention back to Emily. "I heard you," he said quietly. Her eyes widened in confusion. "Heard what?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "At the hospital," Robert replied calmly. "When you thought I couldn't hear anything. When you thought I was already gone." Her breathing became shallow and uneven. Mark's face tightened, his jaw clenching hard. "You told him," Robert continued, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You told him once I was declared dead, the house would be yours. The insurance too." Gasps spread across the church again, louder this time. A woman in the second row covered her mouth with both hands. Emily shook her head rapidly. No, you misunderstood," she said desperately. "You were sick, confused." Robert stepped closer, his voice lowering. "I was dying," he said. "Not deaf." Mark suddenly grabbed Emily's arm tightly, his voice low and harsh. "Stop talking," he whispered. Robert noticed the movement instantly. Fear. Real fear. That was what he had been waiting to see. He slowly turned toward the crowd again. "For weeks," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I lay in a hospital bed, declared dead, while my own daughter planned to profit from my death." The words landed heavily in the silent room. Emily's breathing turned into quiet sobs now, but there were still no tears. Not real ones. Just panic. Robert held up the envelope again. "And that's not even the worst part," he added. Mark's eyes locked onto the envelope instantly. "What's in that?" he demanded sharply. Robert smiled faintly. "Proof," he replied. That single word hit harder than anything else he had said. Proof. Mark's confidence cracked visibly. Emily swayed slightly, gripping the back of the chair to stay upright. "What proof?" she asked weakly. Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly removed a small digital recorder from the envelope and held it up where everyone could see. The room fell into complete silence again. Robert pressed a single button. A faint crackling sound filled the air, followed by a voice. Emily's voice. Clear. Cold. Unmistakable. "Once he's officially declared dead, we can file the insurance claim immediately." The recording echoed through the church like thunder. Every single person in the room froze. Emily's face turned ghostly pale. Mark stepped backward instinctively, as if the sound itself had pushed him away. And the house. Mark's recorded voice followed. The lawyer already checked. It transfers to you automatically. A loud gasp broke from somewhere in the crowd. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Robert let the recording play for a few more seconds before stopping it. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Heavy. Unforgiving. Emily collapsed into her chair, her body shaking violently now. Mark stood frozen, unable to speak. Unable to deny what everyone had just heard. Robert lowered the recorder slowly. "This funeral," he said quietly, "was supposed to bury me." He paused, letting his words settle into the stunned silence. But instead, his eyes locked onto Mark. "It buried your lies." And in that exact moment, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church creaked open. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside. Their presence sent another wave of whispers through the crowd. Robert didn't turn to look at them, because he already knew they were coming. And as the officers began walking slowly down the aisle, Mark's confidence finally shattered, because he realized something terrifying. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was justice catching up. The sound of the police officers' footsteps echoed slowly through the church, each step heavier than the last. The whispers in the room faded into uneasy silence as people turned in their seats to watch the 2 officers walk down the aisle with calm, steady expressions. Mark's breathing grew louder, uneven, almost desperate. This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound confident. "You can't just walk in here and accuse people without proof." Robert didn't look at him. Instead, he watched as the officers approached, their faces serious but controlled. Emily remained seated, her hands shaking uncontrollably in her lap. Her eyes darted between Robert and the officers like an animal searching for an escape that didn't exist. One of the officers, a tall man with gray hair and sharp eyes, stopped a few feet away from Robert. "Mr. Hayes?" he asked calmly. Robert nodded once. "Yes," he replied quietly. The officer gave a slight nod in return, then turned his attention toward Emily and Mark. "Emily Hayes and Mark Lawson," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the silent church. "We need to ask you both a few questions regarding an ongoing investigation." The words hit like a hammer. Emily let out a weak gasp. "Investigation?" she whispered. Mark stepped forward suddenly, trying to regain control of the moment. "You can't do this here," he snapped. "This is a private service." The second officer spoke this time, his tone firm but controlled. "Sir, this became a criminal matter the moment fraud and falsified death reports were filed." A low murmur spread across the crowd again. Robert watched quietly as Mark's confidence continued to crack. For weeks, Robert had imagined this moment. The moment when fear would replace greed in their eyes. And now it was happening exactly as he had planned. Emily slowly stood from her seat, her legs visibly weak. "Dad," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Please, this isn't necessary. We can talk about this privately." Robert finally looked directly at her. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not hatred, but disappointment. Deep, crushing disappointment. "You already talked," he replied quietly. "At the hospital. When you thought I was dying." Emily's lips trembled. "That wasn't what it sounded like," she whispered weakly. But even she didn't sound convinced. Robert reached into his coat again and removed a folded stack of papers. He handed them calmly to the officer standing beside him. "These are copies of the insurance claim documents," Robert said. "Filed 2 days after I was declared dead." The officer unfolded the papers slowly, scanning them carefully. Mark's face tightened as he recognized the documents instantly. "That doesn't prove anything," he snapped. "That's normal procedure after someone dies." Robert tilted his head slightly. "Except," he said calmly, "the signature authorizing my life insurance payout was dated before my official time of death." That sentence hit harder than the recording. Even the officer's expression changed slightly as he rechecked the document. Emily shook her head frantically. "No, that's not possible," she whispered. But Robert continued. You were in a hurry, he added quietly. Too much of a hurry. Mark's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. You don't understand paperwork, Mark said sharply. Mistakes happen. Robert let out a slow breath. Oh, I understand paperwork very well, he replied. 42 years working as an engineer teaches you how to read details, especially when your life depends on them. The officer finished scanning the papers and nodded slightly to his partner. We'll need both of you to come with us, he said firmly. Emily's body stiffened instantly. Come with you? She asked, her voice barely audible. For questioning, the officer replied. Mark stepped backward, shaking his head. This is insane, he muttered. We didn't do anything wrong. Robert watched him carefully. Fear had fully replaced arrogance now. That was the turning point. But Robert wasn't finished yet. Not even close. There's more, Robert said quietly. The officers turned toward him again. Robert reached into his pocket one last time and removed a small flash drive. The final piece. The most dangerous piece. This contains the full hospital hallway footage, Robert explained calmly. Video showing them discussing the insurance payout before my death was confirmed. Mark's eyes widened instantly. Emily's knees buckled slightly, forcing her to grab the back of a chair to stay upright. How did you get that? Mark demanded, his voice sharp with panic. Robert didn't answer directly. Instead, he spoke slowly, deliberately. Because someone at that hospital still believes in doing the right thing. For a brief moment, Daniel's face flashed through Robert's memory. The young nurse who refused to let him die in silence. Without him, none of this would have been possible. The officer carefully accepted the flash drive and slipped it into his pocket. That will be added to the case, he said. The words felt final. Heavy. Unavoidable. Emily began to cry now. Real tears this time, not staged ones. Dad, please, she sobbed. I didn't mean for this to happen. Robert studied her face carefully. The fear. The regret. The realization that everything was collapsing. You meant it when you said it, he replied quietly. That's what matters. Mark suddenly turned toward the side exit, his body shifting slightly as if calculating the distance. Robert noticed it immediately. So did the officers. Sir, one officer said sharply. Stay where you are. Mark froze. For a split second, it looked like he might run. But then he slowly raised his hands, surrendering to the moment. Emily sobbed louder, her voice echoing through the silent church. This was supposed to be simple, she cried. We were drowning in debt, we thought. You thought my death would fix your problems, Robert interrupted calmly. She didn't deny it. Because she couldn't. The truth was no longer hiding. It stood in the open, undeniable. The officers stepped closer to Mark and Emily. You are not under arrest at this time, one officer said firmly. But you will come with us for questioning. Mark swallowed hard, his throat visibly tightening. Emily nodded weakly, unable to speak anymore. As the officers guided them toward the aisle, the crowd shifted aside, creating a narrow path through the stunned guests. Every eye followed them. Every whisper carried judgment. Robert remained standing near the casket, watching silently as they were escorted away. For weeks, he had imagined this moment, wondered how it would feel. Victory. Relief. Closure. But what he felt instead was something heavier. Not satisfaction. Not joy. Just the quiet weight of betrayal finally being acknowledged. As Emily reached the church doors, she turned one last time. Her eyes locked onto Robert's. Why didn't you just stay gone? She whispered hoarsely. The question hung in the air like smoke. Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the casket, then back at her. Because the truth deserves to be buried, he said quietly. He paused for a moment. But not me. The doors closed behind them with a heavy thud. And just like that, the funeral ended. But Robert knew this was only the beginning. Because the real revenge would happen in court. The church doors closed behind them, and the heavy sound echoed like the end of something irreversible. Silence returned again. But it was no longer the same silence as before. It was empty now. Final. Robert stood alone near the casket, the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on the room like invisible pressure. Slowly, people began to leave. Chairs creaked. Footsteps faded. Whispered conversations dissolved into the cold air outside. Soon only Robert remained. And the coffin. He walked slowly toward it. The name engraved on the metal plate reflected the dim light above. Robert Hayes. Beloved father. 1948, 2026. That he stared at it for a long time. Not because he didn't believe it anymore, but because for a few weeks he had actually lived it. He had been dead in every way that mattered. Ignored. Betrayed. Erased. Behind him, the officer's voice echoed faintly from earlier words still hanging in the air. This will go to court. Yes, court. That was where the real ending would be written. But before that, there was something else Robert needed to do. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded photograph. It was old, faded at the edges. A picture of him, Emily, and her mother from years ago, when life was still simple, before money, greed, and desperation had changed everything. He stared at Emily's smiling face in the photo, and for the first time that day, something inside him cracked. Not anger, not revenge, but memory. A quiet voice inside him asked the question he had been avoiding since the hospital. How did it come to this? Footsteps broke his thoughts. Daniel stood near the entrance of the church, hesitant, unsure whether to enter. He had been there the whole time, waiting outside. Robert looked at him and gave a small nod. Thank you, Robert said quietly. Daniel shook his head. You did the hard part, he replied. I just gave you a chance. Robert let out a slow breath. A second chance. That was what this really was. Not revenge. Not punishment. But correction. A system that had tried to erase him had failed. Days later, the courtroom was packed. Reporters. Lawyers. Witnesses. Emily sat at one side, pale and exhausted. Mark avoided eye contact with everyone. The evidence was overwhelming. Insurance fraud. False declaration of death. Conspiracy to transfer property. Hospital documentation manipulation. Every layer of their plan was exposed. And Robert? He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. The recording spoke for him. The documents spoke for him. Even silence spoke louder than their excuses. When the final verdict came, the judge's voice was firm. Guilty. Emily broke down immediately. Mark closed his eyes, not in regret, but defeat. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions. But Robert didn't stop. He walked past them slowly, stepping into the sunlight for the first time without feeling like he was carrying a grave inside him. Daniel followed behind him quietly. You're okay now? He asked. Robert looked ahead for a long moment. I survived, he said simply. That's enough. But as they walked away, Robert knew something most people never understand. Revenge doesn't feel like victory. It feels like weight being lifted, but never fully gone. Because some betrayals don't just break trust. They change people forever. And sometimes, the hardest part isn't exposing the truth. It's learning how to live after it. If you want more stories like this, subscribe for more true-style revenge